The tragedy of Afghanistan. The United States failed in its mission on Afghanistan. Why? The U.S. experience in Afghanistan, like that of the great powers that came before it, will not soon be forgotten. Before launching the 2001 campaign, few Americans had an appreciation for the country's history and subtle complexities. Despite the U.S. involvement in the Soviet Union's defeat in the 1980s, U.S. policymakers had to relearn that building a government in a fractured, xenophobic country is almost infinitely more challenging than overthrowing one. The rise of the insurgency in the wake of the U.S. victory over Taliban was deeply unfortunate, but it was not inevitable. Indeed, the irony of the U.S. experience is that some of America's most seasoned diplomats and military commanders in Afghanistan did understand the country, but they could not get through to their leaders, who were initially uninterested in nation building and distracted by Iraq. Zalmay Khalilzad, who had grown up in Afghanistan, and Ronald Newman, whose first expedition to Afghanistan was in 1967, had a keen appreciation for the historic challenges they faced in Afghanistan. But despite their calls for greater resources and attention, and those of several of their colleagues, such support never came. In order to restore peace in Afghanistan, we must first understand the causes of war. Afghanistan's insurgency was caused by a supply of disgruntled villagers unhappy with their government and a demand for recruits by ideologically motivated leaders, too little outside support for the Afghan government and too much support for insurgents further undermined governance. This combination proved deadly for the onset and continuation of the insurgency. Afghanistan, as currently understood, is a British colonial construction in both material and ideological terms. Afghan elites have uncritically absorbed and reproduced colonial frameworks of reckoning about themselves and their homeland. We can see this effect mainly through national imagery anchored in Orionism, Kabul, and Jihad. The capstone or takeaway position adopted here is that until American and other new colonial actors in the country today become cognizant of and transcend the contradictions and inconsistencies of classic colonial forms of knowledge, their project and visions of Afghanistan will remain literally and practically unrealistic and unrealized. The existence of weak and ineffective government was a critical precondition to the rise of violence in Afghanistan. In the past, insurgencies have been likely to develop and acquire local support where state control has declined or collapsed. Afghan leaders at all levels failed to provide good governance. National and local officials were unable to manage resources effectively and implement sound policies in rural areas of the country, such as the southern provinces of Kandahar and Helmand. There was virtually no improvement in the provision of key services such as electricity and water from the Taliban to the Ghani, the existing president of Afghanistan era. Reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan's violent south have largely been relegated to urban areas because security conditions are so dangerous. This created grievances among the local population who turned to the Taliban and other groups for order and justice. Institutions such as the Afghan National Police were unable to contain a monopoly of violence because of corruption and incompetence, as well as the power of local warlords. police checkpoints were sometimes used to shake down local population, and they regularly took bribes to allow licit and illicit goods to pass along routes they controlled. Also, support to the Afghan government was strikingly insufficient as US policymakers began their sojourn into Afghanistan. I recommended reassuring the Pashtuns that nation building is not our key strategic goal, acknowledged Under-Secretary of Defense Douglas Feet. Rumsfeld was determined not to do nation building, as the United States typically did in the 1990s. Indeed, the United States adopted a light footprint approach, but they ultimately would be forced to engage in nation building to save a country that lacked the basic government institutions necessary to prevent a return of the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and other militant groups. But they did it on the cheap. The number of international troops per capita in Afghanistan was significantly less than virtually every nation-building operation since World War II. By 2003, U.S. financial resources that could have been devoted to Afghanistan were going to Iraq, squandering a momentous opportunity. In addition, insurgents were also able to gain significant assistance from the international jihadi network in neighboring states such as Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, as well as Russia and India. In one of his final reports before leaving Afghanistan in 2008 as the European Union's Special Representative, Francis Vondrel reflected on his decade in Afghanistan and remarked that we blinded ourselves to growing evidence that Pakistan, contrary to assurances, was condoning the presence of and providing assistance to the Taliban and keeping with its old policy of supporting extreme Islamist groups as the best means of installing a pliable government in Kabul. Ironically, Pakistan was not immune to the spreading militancy. The monster that elements in the ISI intended to send to Afghanistan has turned against Pakistan itself. Despite several decades of war, beginning with the Soviet invasion, the reign of Zahir Shah, which lasted from 1933 to 1973, included the longest period of peace and prosperity in Afghanistan's recent history. During that period, the king found a balance between the central government in Kabul and the local tribal officials who mistrusted national leaders. French social scientist Olivier Troy reminds us that the history of Afghanistan is one of revolts against the central power and of resistance to the penetrations of countryside by state bureaucracy. British as a colonial power imposed a brutal ruler under the name of Amir Abdurrahman in defense of its interests in the region at the beginning of 21st century. In the context of Great Game, Amir Abdurrahman was a foreign agent and in defense of British interests in the region, murdered countless common people. Since then, Afghanistanis few Afghanistan contrast central bureaucracy. Based on these challenges and the country's history, the United States should have followed several critical steps to achieve security. It must have confronted corruption, partnered with local, not just Kabul entities, and undermined the sanctuary in Pakistan. The goal of an effective strategy should have been to improve the competence and legitimacy of Kabul and local institutions to provide security and services to the local population. Success in any counterinsurgency hinges on the support of the local population. The main cause of U.S. failure can be summed up in support of corrupt regimes under its linchpins, Hamid Karzai and Ghani Ahmadzai. US seems to be moving on the footprint of UK and imposing puppets in defense of its interests at the cost of local population. After the Taliban refused to run over bin Laden, President Bush ordered the invasion of Afghanistan and backed a rebel group called the Northern Alliance to oust the Taliban from power. If US policy was to make common people happy, restoring Northern Alliance to power spoiled that effort. Northern Alliance was responsible for destruction of Kabul and murder of tens of thousands of innocent lives when Afghanistan was in their hands. The US has desperately been trying to fight terrorism by imposing a corrupt government under Hamid Karzai and Ghani Ahmadzai. The US did not fail in defeating Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but it utterly failed to establish a workable government in the country. In Bonn in December 2001, after Taliban's defeat, US representatives spoiled the process of democracy regarding Afghanistan. Zalmay Khalilzad, as a special representative of George W. Bush, announced it was the policy of the US government to have a Pashtun as the future leader of Afghanistan. Accordingly, Karzai was imposed because he was an Abdali Pashtun, and the individual who was democratically elected as the head of the interim government was rejected because he was not a Pashtun.